left off. So moving along very quickly to essay questions. So there are 3 essay questions. So like there are 3 source-based questions, there are also 3 essay questions. And the 3 essay questions are question 4, which is the 1980s international resistance to apartheid. Question 5, which is the road to democracy. Question 6, which is the end of the Cold War and its effect on South Africa. So I'm just going to quickly go over how to answer essay questions and then the content which needs to be in the essay questions. Right. So how to write an argumentative essay. So unlike English and Afrikaans and other subjects, you do not write a story in history. I have to emphasize that because my learners wrote paper 1 the other day, and there was a child that wrote a story, and I was like, did I teach you nothing, young Padawan? So anyway, when you write history, you are writing an argumentative essay, which means you are arguing a point, you are a lawyer. So the first thing you need to do when you get to that section B, and I do stress that answer your essay question first because it can take you a long time to write that essay, especially if you're writing it properly. If you finish that essay in under 30 minutes, you're probably doing something wrong, you're probably leaving something out. So when you get that paper and they say, okay, you can start writing, first thing you do, you go to your essay questions and you choose your topic. Majority of people either answer question 4 or question 5. So my students would do question 4. You take a position or a stance. So you read the question. It's very important to read the question so that you know how your essay needs to be structured, and it helps you when you build up your line of argument. So you take your position, you take your stance, you gather your evidence to justify why you say the position that you say. So if you disagree, then your evidence kind of needs to align with the fact that you disagree. If it's asking you to discuss, you need to gather evidence to show that you are discussing. You need to present that evidence logically. So that's why we talk about the PEEL system. You got a P all over that essay. Point, explain, example, and link it back to the question. And then lastly, but you won't really need to do this. The way that our exams are structured, they don't really want this sort of answer where you provide a counter argument. So sometimes when you get to university, you'll worry about that. So you give your argument and then you say, but the other side says this, and then you go and you debunk that argument. You say that this is why they're wrong. So providing counter arguments, you don't really need to worry about it now in high school, but when you get to university level, you're going to have to start doing that. Right, so plan your essay in 10 minutes or less. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So go to the back of your booklet when you get it and fold your paper down the middle. You can label one column your main ideas and the other column evidence. So just to help you organize your thoughts, how I taught my essay to my kids is I taught it to them with headings. And then obviously when they have to write it, they have to leave out the headings. So stressing you so much, do not write headings in the history essay. It's fine if you want to do planning. Then you can just write your headings down so you know, oh yes, I must speak about that, I must speak about that, I must speak about that. And that's going to be your main ideas. And then your other column will be your evidence. So it's going to look something like this. So right at the back of the book, you're going to fold the page in half. Main ideas, boycotts, there were sports, cultural, consumer, academic. And then the evidence for that is that South Africa was banned from Olympics, the British Actors Union refused to work in SA, British refused to buy outspanned fruit, and academics refused to work with SA. So that kind of just summarizes the essay for you. Especially since there's a lot of information when it comes to history essays, and it's very difficult to keep all of that information in your head. So if you write it down, you kind of create a reference point for yourself. But I must stress that you must remember to draw a neat line through your planning after you are done so the marker doesn't accidentally mark it. So when we get to the marking center, sometimes kids write a rough copy, but then they don't draw a line through, and then we end up marking the rough copy. And then it's a bit of an awkward situation because now the rough copy is not obviously perfect. It's not done according to the PEEL system. It's just outlining the ideas. So just be careful when you do planning, that it's clearly labeled as planning and that you draw a line through so it doesn't accidentally get marked, because it can actually disadvantage you if your planning gets marked as an actual essay. Okay, so let's move along. How to answer. When writing essays, the most important thing to remember is your line of argument. So that's something that learners really, really struggle with, but it's not really as difficult as it seems. All you need to do basically is you have to use words from the question in the last line of each paragraph just to prove that you are answering the question. So each paragraph needs to refer back to the question. So if the question was, was the international anti-apartheid movement successful in bringing a downfall to apartheid, then at the end of each paragraph you would write, this proves that so and so was successful in bringing an end to apartheid, or therefore the boycotts were not the only method used to help end apartheid. So you're just using that same word over and over and over, like that key word that you read in your question at the end of each paragraph. So this proves that nah was successful. This proves that nah was successful, etc., etc., etc. Can you guess what the questions might have been for these two example arguments? So if we look at the first example, this proves that sanctions were successful in bringing into apartheid. So we can determine there, because the key word there is successful, the question probably had something to do with the success of the international anti-apartheid movement, or maybe the success of the sanctions in particular. Then you also get, therefore boycotts were not the only method used to help end apartheid. The question would probably be then, were boycotts the only method to end apartheid? So therefore those keywords always referring back to the question, showing that we are answering the actual question. We're not just throwing facts on the table and expecting to win. Right, so now I'm going to do my 10-minute thing. Wish me luck. I'm always going longer than the actual 10 minutes, which is a bit of a but I'll try and keep it short and sweet. So topic 4, 1980s international resistance to apartheid. I do have a essay, a video where I actually speak about this essay in detail, and I'll just link that in the description below. Right, so let's have a look. So this is question 4. So the 1980s international resistance essay, I got this from Miss Dorcas from Spine Road, where all you need to do is you have to remember the bad stuff. And the bad stuff would be the boycotts, the anti-apartheid movement, the disinvestments, sanctions, the trade unions, the understanding, the free Mandela, and the frontline states. So over here you can see some pictures that are basically related to this essay. If you cover all of these things here, you've basically covered the essay. So each of these would be like a paragraph. And then because you know, okay, I have to do a paragraph on the boycotts, I have to do a paragraph on the anti-apartheid movement, you know you've covered everything. You can see the apartheid kills, look at the labels, don't buy South African goods. If you were to guess, you'd see that is consumer boycotts, where people didn't buy South African products. There you can see a picture of Nelson Mandela. It says Mandela must be set free. That's obviously referring to the Free Mandela campaign. And then you've got boycott now, Coca-Cola, trademark registered, Coke sweetens apartheid. Once again, consumer boycotts, not buying products from South Africa. It could also be disinvestment, because Coke actually disinvested from South Africa in the 80s. And then you've got sanctions against apartheid South Africa, referring obviously to the sanctions, the fact that other countries didn't want to trade with South Africa. So one of my students actually came up with a really clever idea, and he said, but Miss, this whole essay can just be described in one sentence. And that sentence is, nobody wanted anything to do with South Africa. So with boycotts, other countries didn't want to buy products or services from South Africa. With disinvestments, they took out all of their money out of South Africa. With sanctions, they didn't allow South Africa to come to their countries, land their airplanes there. didn't want to buy their oil or their weapons, with trade unions, workers pressurizing their bosses not to do business with South Africa, with understanding, spreading the message of apartheid is bad, with Free Mandela fighting for Nelson Mandela to be released from prison to end apartheid, and with the frontline states refusing to work with the apartheid government and actually helping the liberation movement. So what needs to be in this essay? So in the first place, so I've just taken this straight from a memo. You'll see that certain sections are actually in more detail than other sections. So the things that where you see like a massive a paragraph, that's where the majority of your information, you need to focus on that. Where you see there's only one bullet, you don't need to go into too much detail about it. You can give like maybe 5 lines or so on that. So you'll see that reasons for the formation of the anti-apartheid movement and the Irish anti-apartheid movement. So why did the anti-apartheid movement start? Five lines just saying PW Botha, unwillingness to change, anti-apartheid movement started to pressurize them through boycott, sanctions, and disinvestments. And even though they started in 1959 and 1960 respectively, the actual bulk of their fight started in the 80s. So in the 1980s, they started the IDAF, the International Defense and Aid Fund. IDAF, sometimes it's in, sometimes it's not. So I'd include it just to be safe, but it's basically other countries giving money to South Africa so that they can pay for the court cases of people or activists that get arrested by the apartheid government. Sports boycotts, so they give you some examples where New Zealand protested against the racist Springbok tour. And the result of that is in the 1980s, South Africa is banned from 90% of world sport, which isolates South Africa. So in this essay, the words that you're always going to use is isolate or pressurize. So the sports boycott isolated South Africa, the cultural boycotts isolated South Africa, the academic boycotts isolated South Africa, the consumer boycotts pressurized South Africa because now nobody's trading with them. Cultural boycotts, artists against apartheid, Freedom Festival, lots of people that basically are not selling their television programs in South Africa. Academic boycotts, scholars refused to travel to South Africa. International conferences didn't allow South African delegates. They refused to recognize South African degrees, etc. What's the result of that? South Africa is isolated. Consumer boycott, South African experiencing a recession because people don't want to buy South African products, refuse to handle fruits from South Africa, refuse to import coal, iron, or steel. What's the result of that? It creates economic pressure. Disinvestment, lots of big countries pulling their money out of South Africa. Foreign investments drops by a large amount. Barclays Bank pulls out of South Africa. What's the result of this? The rand is devalued, and it leads to $3 billion being removed from South Africa, which creates a complete economic crisis, which pressurizes South Africa to end apartheid. Sanctions, Sullivan Principle, which says that you cannot work with a country that doesn't treat everyone equally, which means that a lot of companies actually are legally not allowed to work with South Africa. United Nations call for sanctions against South Africa. So a lot of countries that were in the United Nations refused to buy oil and weapons from South Africa, refused to allow South African ships and airplanes from landing in their country. What's the result of that? The Johannesburg Stock Exchange closes for 4 days, the value of the rand drops, creates an economic crisis. And once again, that pressurizes South Africa to end apartheid. And then you've got the role of international trade unions. Basically, a trade union is a group of workers that are fighting for the rights of workers. So they say that they're refusing to work with South Africa. So do you see how my students' one sentence can actually apply to everything here? Unfortunately, your essay can't just be one sentence long. So then at the end of the essay, you would speak about the Release Mandela campaign. You'll see it's only one bullet, so you don't need to go into too much detail, maybe about 5 lines on that, and 5 lines on the role of the frontline states. and then how all of this all together led to the end of apartheid. Oh, I actually managed to do it in less than 10 minutes. Go me. Okay, so I'm going to cancel that and then start again. So question 5 is the road to democracy. That's also quite a popular one to answer. Let's go through it as quickly as possible. So the road to democracy essay now, Ms. Dorcas didn't give me a thingy for this one. So I just did it in my way, which is basically to outline it based on the year that things happened. So the first thing that happened was F.W. de Klerk's speech to the Parliament in 1990, then the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of political parties, which also happened in 1990, the Grooteskeer Minute 1991, the Pretoria Minute 1991, Codesa 1 also 1991. So I kind of group it into what happens in that year. There's many ways that you can group this essay, but the best way to do it is chronologically. And then you have the violence that results from Codesa 1, or the violence that happens in between Codesa 1 and Codesa 2. The whites-only referendum, Codesa 2 in 1992. The violence that results from Codesa 2, or basically the violence after Codesa 2 or during Codesa 2 that kind of disrupts it. The Record of Understanding in 1992, Chris Heine's murder in 1993, multi-party negotiations in 1993, the Sunset Clause in 1993, the election date in 1994, and the dawn of a new South Africa in 1994. Now, I personally haven't done this essay. I did it with about 5 kids in my class, so I myself don't know this essay that well, but I know it well enough. Right, so what needs to be in this essay? You need to speak about how de Klerk comes to power in 1989, just a brief background of how P.W. Botha didn't want to change, but when F.W. de Klerk came in, he unbanned the political organizations such as the ANC and the SACP, and he planned to release Mandela from prison. They had the secret talks before the talks, where they were discussing what are they going to allow, what are they not going to allow, etc. So one of the first violence, so usually with this essay they'll say there's lots of challenges, there's lots of roadblocks, there's lots of obstacles. So one of the first obstacles, so you've got this idea of releasing Mandela from prison, looks like it's all going to be smooth sailing. No, because immediately violence erupts in Sebokeng, where police open fire on protesters and they kill 14 people. So the government makes like they are willing to talk to the liberation movement, but then you've got the apartheid police that are still killing people. So they're promising that they're negotiating in good faith, but it doesn't look like it's happening. Then you had the ANC cancelling planned meetings with the government because you are not negotiating in good faith. Then you've got the ANC and the National Party meeting from the 2nd to 4th of May. So that's the Grooteskeer. No, that's not. Yeah, it is the Grooteskeer minute. Basically, only the ANC and the National Party meeting, discussing challenges to the process of negotiation. Like, for example, the apartheid government wanted the ANC to stop their armed struggle, and the ANC wanted the apartheid government to repeal the apartheid laws. So they were just discussing what are they going to change to show that they're all negotiating in good faith. So the challenges to the process of negotiations were discussed. Both the ANC and the National Party committed themselves to peaceful negotiations, and that became known as the Grooteskeer Minute because it took place at Grooteskeer in Cape Town. There was an event that happened between the Grooteskeer and the Pretoria Minute, but I can't remember what it was, so I'm not going to mention it. But in the Pretoria Minute, they basically just ratify, or what's another word for ratify? They basically come to a decision. So in the Grooteskeer Minute, it's just discussions, and in Pretoria Minute, it's decisions. So Grooteskeer Minute, they do start repealing apartheid laws and things like that. And in the Pretoria Minute, the ANC agrees to suspend their armed struggle. So the NP wanted them to stop it, but they decided they're just going to suspend it because they still don't trust each other 100%. Also at the Pretoria Minute, the apartheid government ends the state of emergency. So the state of emergency is basically similar to what we had now with COVID, but that was a state of disaster where the government basically had carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. So if they could just arrest you for no reason, because the country's in a state of emergency. So at the Pretoria Minute, it was decided that the state of emergency needs to end and more political prisoners are released. So they kind of getting to a point to show that we are negotiating, we're willing, you give a little bit, I give a little bit. But unfortunately, they are exposed in the Inkatha Gate scandal, where the government was secretly funding the Inkatha Freedom Party to commit acts of violence against the ANC. So the government claims, like they got the one face where they say, oh, but we're negotiating and da da da, and on the other side there was causing nonsense in between the IFP and the ANC. So then we have people that don't really agree with the negotiations and things like this. The next thing that happens is CODESA 1. So the Grootse Minute and the Pretoria Minute is basically just ANC NP. And then you've got CODESA 1, which includes 19 political parties. It excludes groups like AZAPO, so the Zambian People's Organization. You will remember they are a Black consciousness organization, so they believe in Black empowerment, and they refuse to negotiate with the apartheid government. So you have what they call left-wing and right-wing groups. So AZAPO would be part of the left-wing group. The Communist Party, also part of the left wing, and the PAC, Pan-Africanist Congress, also part of the left wing, where they didn't want to negotiate with the apartheid government. Also, you had people on the right wing that refused to negotiate, such as the AWB or the AWB, Afrikaner something. I'm not 100% sure on that, so let me not say that. So at CODESA 1, they start discussing a new constitution. They start discussing how is the new South Africa going to look like? How is the government in between this transition period? How are you going to go from apartheid to democracy? You can't just flip a switch and go from apartheid to democracy. You have to work through it in a way that is fair and a way that everybody can have a say and have a voice. So at CODESA 1, the delegates sign a declaration of intent, where they all make basically a promise to have peaceful and fair negotiations and free and fair elections to achieve a democratic South Africa. Unfortunately, CODESA 1 ends in failure because people were not able to agree on key issues such as who's going to run the government and how is this new constitution going to look like. Then you've got CODESA 2, which is a few months after CODESA 1, but in the next year, which was in the 2nd of May 1992, which also collapsed because parties failed to agree on a new constitution-making body and an interim government. So what was the big problem with CODESA 2? The National Party wanted what we call a minority veto. So they wanted whatever rules the ANC comes up with, they wanted to have the right to say, no, we don't want to follow that rule. Whereas the ANC wanted an interim government for no longer than 18 months and simple majority rule. So they didn't want to have anyone being able to veto any decisions that they come up with. So it had to be like majority. So if 60% vote for this, then this is going through, whether the 40% like it or not. And in between CODESA 1 and CODESA 2, you've got the Boipatong massacre. I always get confused between the Boipatong and the Bisho massacre. I know that the one was when the police basically said that they weren't involved, and then it was discovered that the police were actually involved, and a lot of people actually ended up dying. And then, oh yeah, I was right. So the Boipatong massacre is where there's violence that erupts in the township, and then they discover basically that the police were behind it. So the ANC called off negotiations following news of the government being involved in the violence. And then you had the Bisho massacre, where 28 protesters were killed once again by the The record of understanding was signed on the 26th. So basically, Codeso 1 and Codeso 2 was failures, and it seems like the negotiations have reached a stalemate. So it's not moving. So then you've got Rolf Mayer from the National Party and Cyril Ramaphosa from the ANC. Oh, oopsie, running out of time. That decide they are going to work together, and then it seems like everything's back on track, and then boom, on the 10th of April 1993, Chris Hani, who was actually a very popular leader of the South African Communist Party, was assassinated. So he was actually the one that a lot of people thought he was going to be president of South Africa, and then he was murdered. So this led to violence. It led to a lot of people becoming very angry, wanting to end the negotiations, wanting to go towards civil war. And it's the first time that Nelson Mandela was actually asked by F.W. de Klerk to go on TV and ask for people to remain calm, to kind of support the negotiations. So the assassination of Chris Hani was this major, major roadblock in this road to democracy. But it does allow Nelson Mandela to come out as an alternative leader and just to reconcile the nation. And then you've got the multi-party negotiating forum. So it's similar to CODESA, where you've got a whole lot of different political parties coming together, working together, negotiating together. It's not just the ANC and the NP deciding on everything. And then after the multi-party negotiating forum, you also had the St. James massacre. I'll link you to a video by my friend Fiona, who was actually present at the St. James massacre. But basically, members of APLA stormed a church called St. James, and they threw grenades and shot machine guns and stuff into the church. They ended up killing a lot of white people and injuring a lot of white people, and that also became a roadblock to democracy. And then you have the Heidelberg Tavern attack, which I will admit I know absolutely nothing about, so I'm not going to go into that. And then you had the right wing, which is the RVB. They decided to attack the World Trade Center. So the World Trade Center was where they were having these negotiations. So attacking it was a deliberate attempt to kind of derail the negotiations. And it shows that a lot of very, very right-wing conservative white South Africans kind of against negotiating with Black people and Black South Africans. And then that also leads to a negotiations deadlock, so nothing is moving again. And then Joe Slovo comes up with the sunset clause. So in the sunset clause, it's basically decided that it's not going to be simple majority rule, but we're going to slowly kind of ease out of the white minority rule, and slowly ease in to majority rule, which meant that each political party would be represented at some stage. So the sunset clause actually was a major contribution by the South African Communist Party that broke this negotiation deadlock, because it was something that both the National Party and the ANC could agree with. Then you have the Shell House massacre. I do not know much about that, so I won't say that. And the way you can always end this essay is that you can say that on the 27th of April, we had our first democratic elections, the ANC won, and Nelson Mandela became the first Black South African president. So you can always end this essay by saying that. All right, so here you can see an image of the road to democracy, once again, stolen from Ms. Stokes. So you've got in 1990, the de Klerk speech. Then you've got the Groote Schuur Minute and the Pretoria Minute also in 1990. Inkatha Gate being the first roadblock in the 90s. CODESA 1 in 91. Declaration of Intent that promised that everyone's going to work together. CODESA 2, 92. Boipatong Massacre in 92. Record of Understanding in 92. Chris Hani killed in 93. Multi-Party Negotiating Forum 93. And then the end of the essay is the 1994 election. So I went a little bit of my time, but hopefully that explains everything. All right, so the next thing is topic 6, the end of the Cold War and New World Order. It's not a very popular question to answer, so I can go through it quite quickly. Okay, so this essay can basically be broken down into 4 parts. The first part of the essay is obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, because they'll ask how did the collapse of the Soviet Union lead to changes in South Africa. So you can use about 7 to 10 lines just explaining how Mikhail Gorbachev, with his policies of perestroika and glasnost, actually ended up destroying the Soviet Union instead of building it up. Which basically destroyed communism as a legitimate system, economic and social system, and basically also got in the way of this whole Cold War divide in the world that the apartheid government was using to justify everything that they were doing in South Africa. So the first 7 to 10 lines, you're speaking about Mikhail Gorbachev, perestroika, glasnost, all of those things. What I found is that a lot of learners tend to use a whole 1-2 pages speaking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and like half a page on the impact on South Africa. So you need to kind of balance it out. Collapse of the Soviet Union should only take you maximum 1 page. You shouldn't be using more than 1 page because you're going into too much background, too much detail. Your main focus or the crux of your essay should be the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the ANC, which would be 7 to 10 lines, more or less. The impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the National Party, also 7 to 10 lines, and the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on South Africa as a whole, also 7 to 10 lines. So you'll see it'll give you about 10, 20, 30, 40 lines. So it's about a page and a half. And then plus your introduction, conclusion, and obviously you can bring in more examples, more things. So this essay is actually one of the shortest essays that you will do in history, because the other essays you'll see it'll go up to 3-4 pages long, whereas this essay is about 2.5, 3 pages, depending on how in depth you go. So what needs to be in the essay? Like I said, it's just four things. First thing, impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So just the background of Gorbachev's reforms of perestroika and glasnost and the impact of that. The impact of the disintegration of the Soviet Union by the end of 1989 on South Africa. So the fall of the Berlin Wall meant that the South African government could no longer use communism to justify its policy of apartheid. The Soviet Union was no longer a superpower, and South Africa felt the effects of this. Communism was no longer this global threat, like everyone was scared, you're going to become a communist. We need to stop South Africa from being communist. And because of that, the West, particularly countries like America, Britain, etc., could no longer support the National Party's oppressive policies. So America and Britain were not necessarily supporting South Africa during apartheid because they agreed with what was happening in South Africa, but a lot of countries in the West thought that the ANC and the SACP and the PAC were communist parties and they were going to turn South Africa into a communist country. So with the end of communism in Europe, it basically leads to the end of communism in the world. It's not a viable system, which means that the ANC is not a threat anymore, which means that a lot of countries that were supporting the apartheid government kind of withdraw their support. So then here you got the second part, which is the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the ANC. So the collapse of the Soviet Union presented economic and ideological challenges for the ANC. The economic problem was that the collapse of the Soviet Union kind of removed the ANC's political and economic support. So the Soviet Union was providing weapons, armor, guns, anything that the ANC needed to fight apartheid. The Soviet Union was providing it. Because the ANC was very much aligned to the ideas of communism, aligned to the ideas of socialism. So there was kind of the struggle, the Cold War struggle, that the USSR thought that if the ANC was able to take over, you could bring communism to South Africa and they'd get a bit of a leg up in the Cold War. But now that the USSR no longer exists, the ANC doesn't have that support from the Soviet Union anymore. The ANC realized that it could not depend on the Soviet Union to support it economically or militarily. and the ANC had to rethink its economic policy of socialism, because now they don't have this big brother standing in their corner anymore. They have to do things on their own, and therefore they slowly start to move towards capitalist ideas. And Gorbachev himself was in favor of a peaceful transition of power. So instead of this fight between the ANC and the NP, they negotiate, they come together. So there's that pressure from these superpowers. The next thing you have to speak about is the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the National Party. So the National Party's whole justification for apartheid and the whole justification for the torturing and the murdering and all of that was because they were acting as a bulwark against communist expansion. So they wanted to stop communism in South Africa or in Southern Africa. But now that the USSR is no longer a superpower, that you can see that's a blatant lie. They're just using it as an excuse. And now they can't use that excuse anymore. So the National Party's claim that it was protecting South Africa from a communist takeover became a farce. The Western world powers supported the move that South Africa resolved its problems peacefully and democratically. And it became clear that the National Party could no longer maintain white rule in South Africa anymore. And then lastly, you speak about the impact of the collapse of the USSR on South Africa as a whole. So the impact on the ANC, the impact on the NP, and then on South Africa as a whole. So it forced the National Party and the ANC to negotiate with one another. And the Battle of Cuiabá, I'm not sure how to say that, Quanavela, forced the withdrawal of the South African Defence Force from Angola. So it was kind of a stalemate between the South African Defence Force and the Angolan Liberation Movement, as well as the ANC and Umkhonto weSizwe. And that showed that they couldn't fight anymore. They had to negotiate. The South African government started negotiations with SWAPO, which enabled Namibia to get its independence. The National Party's negotiation with communists in Namibia made it easier for them to negotiate with the ANC, who they also considered communists. P.W. Botha suffered a stroke. So you'll remember from the previous essay that P.W. Botha was the one that really didn't want to end apartheid. So when he has a stroke and he is succeeded by F.W. de Klerk, we start to get this changes happening. So F.W. de Klerk starts to accept that the Black South African struggle is not a conspiracy from Moscow. So it's not to take over, to turn South Africa into a communist country. It's just for freedom and equality. And this enabled de Klerk to engage with discussions with the liberation movement. And on the 2nd of February 1990, de Klerk announced a new and just dispensation, and this signaled the end of apartheid rule and the beginning of democracy. So quite similar to the previous essay, you can also end this essay off by saying that South Africa had its first democratic elections in 1994, and Nelson Mandela became president after the ANC and the SACP were unbanned, directly as a result of the collapse of communism, because communism was not the threat anymore. So ironically, this is actually one of the easiest essays to do, but it's not a very popular essay to answer for some reason. Not sure why. I did it in 2017 and my students also struggled with it, so I kind of dropped it and then I didn't do it again. But yeah, moving along. So I hope this helps you. I apologize for the length, but there was no other way to put the entire paper into a 1-hour lesson. So good luck for your studies for paper 2. I hope this helped. I'm sorry that I kind of rushed through everything, like spending 10 minutes per topic, and then it comes up to 60 minutes actually, a whole hour. But I hope this helps, and good luck. See ya. So you know my email address, and if you want to go to my YouTube channel, it's over there, Teachers United. You can just scan it with your